In the dusty frontier town of Willow Creek, two powerful cattle ranching families, the Blackwoods and the Harmons, have been locked in a bitter feud for over a decade. What started as a dispute over water rights has escalated into violence, threats, and mistrust that divides the entire community. When young Samuel Blackwood proposes to marry Eleanor Harmon, the daughter of his family's greatest enemy, both families see it as either the ultimate betrayal or the only path to peace. But as Samuel and Eleanor navigate their arranged marriage of convenience, they discover that their union may be the key not only to ending generations of hatred, but to saving each other's lives when old enemies and new threats emerge from the unforgiving frontier. The year was 1847, and the territory of Wyoming stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. In the heart of this untamed frontier lay Willow Creek, a settlement where survival depended as much on the strength of your gun hand as the depth of your well. Two names commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the valley: Blackwood and Harmon. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across the northern hills like a kingdom carved from stone and sweat. Jeremiah Blackwood had built his empire one head of cattle at a time, his weathered hands never hesitating to do whatever necessary to protect what was his. His son, Samuel, had inherited not only his father's steel-gray eyes and imposing frame, but also the burden of a feud that had consumed 12 years of their lives. Across the valley beyond the winding creek that gave the town its name, the Harmon spread commanded the southern plains. Thomas Harmon ruled his domain with equal parts cunning and ruthlessness, his black mustache twitching whenever the Blackwood name was mentioned in his presence. His daughter Eleanor had grown up hearing whispered curses about their enemies, learning to load a rifle before she learned to read properly. The feud had begun simply enough, a dispute over water rights during the drought of 1835. Both families claimed ownership of a crucial stretch of Willow Creek that cut through their properties. Words had led to threats to violence, and violence to a cycle of revenge that seemed to have no end. 3 men had died over the years, fences had been cut, cattle rustled, and the entire territory had chosen sides as if preparing for war. Samuel Blackwood stood on the ridge overlooking the disputed creek, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him as the morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. At 28, he had the lean build of a man who spent his days in the saddle and his nights planning strategies. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, reminding him of countless mornings spent riding these same hills with his father, learning the boundaries of their land and the depth of their hatred for the Harmons. But today, something was different. Today, Samuel carried a proposal that would either end the feud forever or ignite a war that would consume them all. The idea had come to him during the long winter months, when the snow had trapped both families in their respective territories and given him time to think beyond the cycle of violence that had defined his entire adult life. The solution was radical, unprecedented, and potentially suicidal, but it was the only path he could see toward peace. He would marry Eleanor Harmon. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. A union between the two families would make any further violence not just inadvisable, but impossible. Their children would inherit lands from both sides of the feud, creating a legacy of cooperation rather than conflict. The very idea made his stomach clench with anxiety, but Samuel had seen enough blood spilled over muddy water to know that something had to change. Eleanor Harmon was no longer the pig-tailed girl he remembered from brief glimpses in town. At 23, she had grown into a woman whose reputation for intelligence and independence had spread throughout the territory. Some said she could outshoot most men, others that she could negotiate cattle prices that would make a banker weep. Samuel had never spoken more than a handful of words to her, but he had watched her from a distance, noting the proud way she carried herself and the fierce loyalty she showed to her family. As he guided his horse down the slope toward the Harmon property, Samuel touched the letter in his vest pocket. He had written and rewritten it a dozen times, each version attempting to strike the right balance between respect and determination. The words felt inadequate for what he was proposing, but they would have to suffice. The Harmon ranch house sat like a fortress in the valley below, its whitewashed walls and green shutters a stark contrast to the wild landscape surrounding it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Samuel could see figures moving in the yard. Ranch hands going about their morning tasks, unaware that their visitor might be carrying the key to ending years of bloodshed. Like this video if you're enjoying this tale of love and redemption in the Old West. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories, and comment below to let us know where in the world you're watching from. Samuel's horse's hooves echoed against the hard-packed earth as he approached the Harmon ranch. 2 cowboys lounged near the corral, their hands moving instinctively toward their gun belts when they recognized the distinctive silhouette of a Blackwood rider. Word spread quickly through the yard, and by the time Samuel reached the hitching post, Thomas Harmon himself had emerged from the house, his weathered face set in granite lines of suspicion and barely contained rage. "You've got some nerve riding onto my property, Blackwood," Thomas growled, his hand resting on the ivory handle of his Colt revolver. His gray hair caught the morning light, and his dark eyes held the accumulated fury of 12 years of conflict. "State your business or get off my land before I decide you're trespassing with ill intent." Samuel dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. He had expected this reception, but facing the legendary Thomas Harmon in person sent a chill of nervous energy through his veins. The older man stood like a coiled spring, ready to unleash violence at the slightest provocation. "I come in peace, Mr. Harmon," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air around them. "I have a proposition that could benefit both our families. I ask only for a few minutes of your time to explain myself." Thomas barked out a harsh laugh, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. "A proposition? From a Blackwood? The only thing your family has ever given mine is grief and gunpowder. You've got 30 seconds to speak your piece before I run you off my property." Before Samuel could respond, the front door of the house opened again, and Eleanor Harmon stepped onto the porch. She moved with the confident grace of a woman accustomed to commanding attention, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun that couldn't entirely contain its natural wave. Her green dress was simple but well-fitted, practical for ranch life, yet flattering enough to remind anyone watching that she was very much a lady. But it was her eyes that caught Samuel's attention, intelligent, alert, and currently fixed on him with undisguised curiosity. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the subtle authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "perhaps we should hear what Mr. Blackwood has to say. It's not every day one of them rides onto our property alone and unarmed." Thomas shot his daughter a warning look, but Eleanor stepped down from the porch with deliberate determination. Samuel found himself studying her face, noting the high cheekbones that spoke of strong character and the slight upturn of her chin that suggested she was not easily intimidated. This was no sheltered ranch princess. This was a woman who had been forged by the same harsh frontier that had shaped them all. "Miss Harmon," Samuel said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I'm honored to finally make your proper acquaintance." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at his formal politeness, but she inclined her head gracefully. "Mr. Blackwood, your reputation precedes you, though I confess I'm curious about what could bring you here today." Samuel took a deep breath and withdrew the letter from his vest pocket. The paper felt almost weightless in his hands, yet he knew it carried enough explosive potential to reshape the entire valley. "What I have to propose is unconventional, but I believe it represents our best hope for ending the conflict between our families." "Spit it out, boy," Thomas snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. Several ranch hands had gathered at a respectful distance, their hands near their weapons and their eyes fixed on the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. "I propose a marriage," Samuel said, his words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "A union between Miss Eleanor and myself, binding our families together and ending this feud once and for all." The silence that followed was so complete that Samuel could hear the wind whistling through the nearby cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle on the range. Eleanor's face went perfectly still, her green eyes widening slightly as she processed what she had just heard. Thomas Harmon's complexion turned an alarming shade of red, and his hand tightened on his gun grip. "You arrogant son of a—" Thomas began, but Eleanor raised her hand, stopping her father mid-curse. "Wait," she said, her voice thoughtful rather than outraged. "Let him explain his reasoning." Samuel felt a surge of gratitude toward Eleanor for her willingness to listen, even as he prepared himself for what would likely be the most important conversation of his life. Samuel felt the weight of every eye in the ranch yard upon him as he gathered his thoughts. Eleanor's unexpected willingness to hear him out had bought him precious moments, but he knew that Thomas Harmon's patience hung by the thinnest of threads. The older man's face had progressed from red to purple, and the ranch hands were shifting nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness a negotiation or a gunfight. "The way I see it," Samuel began, his voice carrying across the tense silence, "this feud has cost both our families more than we can afford to keep paying. Good men have died, cattle have been lost, and our children will inherit nothing but hatred if we don't find a way to break this cycle." Thomas snorted derisively. "Pretty words from the son of the man who shot my brother-in-law." "And your men killed my cousin last spring," Samuel replied evenly, refusing to be drawn into another round of accusation and counter-accusation. That's exactly what I'm talking about. We can keep trading blood for blood until there's nobody left to carry either name, or we can find a better way. Eleanor stepped closer, her green eyes studying Samuel with an intensity that made him feel as though she were looking directly into his soul. "And you believe marriage is that better way?" "I do," Samuel said, meeting her gaze directly. "A union between our families would make us allies instead of enemies. Our children would inherit land from both sides of the creek, making any future conflict not just pointless, but impossible. Instead of fighting over water rights, we'd be sharing them. Assuming either of us survived long enough to have children," Eleanor said dryly. "There are members of both families who might see such a marriage as the ultimate betrayal." Samuel nodded grimly. "I won't lie to you, Miss Harmon. There would be risks. My own father doesn't know I'm here, and I suspect he'll be less than pleased when he finds out. But I've spent months thinking about this, and I can't see any other solution that doesn't end in more graves." Thomas Harmon had been pacing back and forth during this exchange, his boots wearing a path in the dust as he struggled with emotions that seemed to war across his weathered features. Finally, he whirled to face Samuel, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can just ride onto my property and ask for my daughter's hand like we're civilized neighbors having tea?" he roared. "Your family has been trying to destroy mine for 12 years, and now you want to claim the ultimate prize?" "Father," Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through his rage like a blade, "I am not a prize to be claimed by anyone. If this marriage is to be discussed at all, it will be discussed as a practical arrangement between equals, not as some conquest." The steel in her voice surprised Samuel, though he supposed it shouldn't have. Anyone who had survived and thrived in this harsh land would need iron in their backbone, regardless of their gender. Eleanor Harmon was clearly no delicate flower waiting to be plucked. "You're seriously considering this madness?" Thomas asked his daughter, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between her father and Samuel as she weighed options that could reshape all their lives. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and careful. "I'm considering the possibility that Mr. Blackwood might be right about one thing. This feud is destroying us all. How many more men have to die over a stretch of muddy creek? How many more cattle have to be rustled? How many more years do we spend sleeping with guns under our pillows?" She turned to Samuel, her expression unreadable. "But marriage is not a business transaction, Mr. Blackwood, no matter how practical the reasons behind it. If you're serious about this proposal, you need to understand that you're not just asking for a peace treaty, you're asking me to bind my entire life to yours." Samuel felt his throat constrict at the simple truth of her words. In all his planning and calculation, he had focused so intently on the political and practical benefits of the union that he had given little thought to the personal reality of what he was proposing. Marriage meant sharing a home, a bed, a future with someone who was essentially a stranger. "I understand that," he said quietly, "and I won't pretend that I'm offering you a love match. What I can offer is respect, protection, and a chance to build something better than what our fathers have left us." Eleanor studied his face for what felt like an eternity, and Samuel found himself holding his breath as he waited for her response. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with the weight of a decision that would ripple through generations. Eleanor's green eyes never left Samuel's face as she weighed his words, and he found himself admiring the quiet strength that radiated from her even in this moment of uncertainty. Finally, she straightened her shoulders and spoke. "I'll need time to consider your proposal, Mr. Blackwood. This is not a decision to be made in haste, regardless of how practical your reasoning might be." Thomas Harmon exploded. "Consider it? Eleanor, have you lost your mind? This is Jeremiah Blackwood's son standing in our yard asking to marry into the family he's been trying to destroy. And maybe that's exactly why we should listen," Eleanor shot back, her voice rising to match her father's intensity. "Maybe it takes someone from their family to finally see a way out of this madness." Samuel watched the argument unfold between father and daughter, noting the passion that drove both of them. Eleanor's intelligence was evident in every word she spoke, but so was her fierce loyalty to her family. She would not be easily swayed by pretty words or romantic notions. Whatever decision she made would be based on cold logic and practical consideration. "Miss Harmon," Samuel said, interrupting the heated exchange, "I understand your need for time and I respect it, but I should warn you that my presence here won't remain secret for long. My father will learn of this visit, just as yours already has. If we're going to move forward with this plan, we'll need to do it quickly." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "How quickly?" "Days, not weeks," Samuel replied honestly. Once word spreads that I've been here, both our families will be forced to take sides. The longer we wait, the more entrenched the opposition will become. Thomas ran his hands through his graying hair, his face a map of frustration and conflicted emotion. This is insane. Even if Eleanor agreed to this fool notion, how do you propose to handle the wedding? Half the territory would see it as a betrayal, and the other half would assume it was some kind of trap. Samuel had anticipated this question during his long winter planning sessions. We'd need neutral ground. Reverend Williams in town has been calling for peace between our families for years. I believe he'd be willing to perform the ceremony, and the church would provide sanctuary from any immediate reactions. Immediate reactions, Thomas repeated bitterly. You mean gunfights and bloodshed. I mean giving both families time to see the wisdom of the union once it's done, Samuel corrected. People can accept a fait accompli more easily than they can accept a proposal. Eleanor had been listening to this exchange with growing thoughtfulness, her eyes moving between the two men as she processed the practical challenges they were discussing. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of decision that made both men fall silent. There's something you need to understand, Mr. Blackwood. If I agree to this marriage, and I'm not saying I will, it won't be as some passive pawn in your peace plan. I have my own conditions and expectations. Samuel felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. I'm listening. First, this ranch remains in my family's name. I won't have my father stripped of his life's work for the sake of your political convenience. Second, any children we might have will be raised with full knowledge of both family histories, the good and the bad. And third, if this marriage is to work at all, it will be based on genuine partnership, not on some antiquated notion of wifely submission. The steel in her voice left no doubt that these were not negotiable points, and Samuel found himself nodding before he had fully processed all the implications. Eleanor Harmon was clearly not a woman who would be easily dominated or controlled, and perhaps that was exactly what this situation required. Agreed, he said simply. Thomas stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Eleanor, you can't be serious about this. I'm serious about ending this feud before it destroys what's left of both our families, she replied firmly. Mr. Blackwood is right about one thing. We're hemorrhaging blood and money while our neighbors prosper in peace. Something has to change. She turned back to Samuel, her expression resolute. I'll give you my answer tomorrow at sunset. Meet me at the old oak tree by the creek, the one that marks the boundary between our properties. If I decide to accept your proposal, we'll need to move quickly to make the arrangements. Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized that Eleanor Harmon was genuinely considering his proposal. And if you decide against it? Eleanor's smile was grim, but not unkind. Then you'd better have another plan for ending this feud, because I don't think either of us will get a second chance. Samuel spent the longest night of his life staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, watching shadows dance across the rough-hewn beams as moonlight filtered through his window. Every creak of the old ranch house seemed amplified in the darkness, and he found himself starting at sounds that would normally pass unnoticed. By morning, he felt as though he had aged a decade in the span of a few hours. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Samuel went through the motions of his daily routine, checking on the horses, reviewing account books with his foreman, inspecting fence lines, but his mind remained fixed on the approaching sunset and Eleanor's promised answer. His father, Jeremiah, noticed his distraction at breakfast but attributed it to the usual stresses of ranch management. Samuel said nothing to correct this assumption, knowing that the conversation about his unauthorized visit to the Harmon ranch could wait until after Eleanor had made her decision. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Samuel saddled his best horse and rode toward the creek that had divided their properties for more than a decade. The old oak tree stood exactly where it had always been, its massive trunk straddling the invisible line that marked the boundary between Blackwood and Harmon land. Samuel had played beneath its branches as a child, before the feud had made such innocent trespassing impossible. Eleanor was already there when he arrived, her horse grazing peacefully near the water's edge. She had changed from her practical ranch dress into something more formal, a deep blue riding habit that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green in her eyes. Samuel dismounted and approached slowly, trying to read her expression for any hint of what decision she had reached. "Mr. Blackwood," she said formally, inclining her head in greeting. "You're punctual, Miss Harmon," he replied, removing his hat. "I confess I've been watching the clock all day." Eleanor smiled slightly at his admission, and Samuel felt some of the tension in his chest ease. She gestured toward a fallen log that had been polished smooth by years of weather. and they sat facing each other across the small space that seemed to represent the chasm between their families. "I've spent considerable time thinking about your proposal," Eleanor began, her voice steady and measured. "I've weighed the risks against the potential benefits, considered the practical implications, and consulted my own conscience about what path might lead to the greatest good." Samuel held his breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine the course of his future. "I've decided to accept," Eleanor said simply. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had hoped for this outcome, planned for it, dreamed of it, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt surreal. "You're certain?" he managed to ask. Eleanor nodded firmly. "I am, but I want to be absolutely clear about my reasoning. I'm not accepting because I've fallen in love with you during our brief acquaintance, Mr. Blackwood. I'm accepting because I believe this marriage represents our best chance to build something better than what we've inherited." "I understand," Samuel said, and found that he genuinely did. "I respect your honesty, and I hope that in time we might find genuine affection alongside practical partnership." "That would be my hope as well," Eleanor agreed. "Now, if we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. I've already spoken with my father, and while he's far from pleased, he's agreed not to oppose the marriage publicly. He understands the political necessity, even if he despises it personally." Samuel felt a wave of relief. Thomas Harmon's cooperation, however reluctant, would make the logistics considerably easier. "What about the ceremony itself?" "I took the liberty of speaking with Reverend Williams this afternoon," Eleanor said, producing a small piece of paper from her reticule. "He's agreed to perform the ceremony tomorrow evening, provided both families can agree to a temporary truce for the duration of the wedding festivities." "Tomorrow evening?" Samuel's eyes widened at the speed of her planning. Eleanor's smile was both determined and slightly mischievous. "You said we needed to move quickly. I've also arranged for the town's marshal to be present, ostensibly to witness the ceremony but actually to prevent any immediate violence. And I've sent word to both our family's most trusted allies, asking them to attend as a show of support." Samuel found himself both impressed and slightly intimidated by Eleanor's efficiency. In less than 24 hours, she had not only made her decision, but had also begun implementing a comprehensive plan to ensure its success. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, her expression growing serious. "Once we speak our vows, there will be no turning back. Whatever challenges we face, and there will be many, we'll face them together. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Samuel met her gaze directly, seeing the strength and intelligence that would make her either his greatest ally or his most formidable opponent. "I am," he said, and meant it completely. The next evening arrived with unseasonable storm clouds gathering on the horizon, as if nature itself was reflecting the tension that hung over the small church in town. Samuel stood at the altar in his best suit, watching as members of both families filed into the wooden pews with the wariness of soldiers entering enemy territory. The divide was immediately apparent. Blackwood's on the left, Harmon's on the right, with a conspicuous gap down the center aisle that seemed to represent 12 years of bloodshed and mistrust. Reverend Williams stood beside Samuel, his weathered hands gripping his prayer book as he surveyed the congregation with obvious nervousness. Marshal Patterson positioned himself near the back of the church, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, in a gesture that was meant to appear relaxed but fooled no one. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway, Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning. There was no music, no elaborate procession, just Eleanor walking steadily down the aisle with her father at her side, both of them maintaining the dignity and composure that had become their family's trademark. Thomas Harmon's face was a mask of conflicted emotions as he placed his daughter's hand in Samuel's. "Take care of her," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. "She's worth more than this whole damned feud." The ceremony itself was brief and practical, with none of the flowery language that might have accompanied a wedding born of romance rather than necessity. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and respectful, a promise of partnership rather than a declaration of passion. The reception was held in the church's social hall, and for a few hours, it almost felt like a normal wedding celebration. The presence of the marshal and the neutral ground of the church seemed to create a temporary bubble of peace, allowing both families to interact with cautious civility. Samuel watched Eleanor move gracefully between the groups, her natural diplomatic skills on full display as she found common ground with relatives from both sides. As the evening wore on and tensions began to ease, Samuel allowed himself to hope that perhaps this unusual beginning might actually lead to the peace he had envisioned. That hope was shattered when his cousin Jake burst through the doors, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "This is an abomination," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the polite conversation like a knife. "Samuel, you've betrayed everything our family stands for." Several Harmon men rose from their seats, their hands moving toward their weapons, and Samuel could feel the fragile peace of the evening beginning to crumble. Jake, emboldened by the tension he had created, pulled his gun and pointed it directly at Samuel's chest. "This ends now," Jake snarled. "No Blackwood is going to make peace with Harmon scum, not while I'm alive." Time seemed to slow as Samuel stared down the barrel of his cousin's gun, realizing that all his careful planning had not accounted for the possibility of betrayal from within his own family. He saw Jake's finger tighten on the trigger and knew that he was about to die on his wedding night, victim of the very hatred he had tried to end. The gunshot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the church hall, but instead of the burning pain he expected, Samuel felt Eleanor's body slam into his, knocking him sideways just as Jake's bullet whined through the space where he had been standing. Eleanor's own derringer, hidden in the folds of her wedding dress, smoked in her steady hand as Jake collapsed with a cry of pain, clutching his wounded shoulder. "The next person who draws a weapon in this church will not be so fortunate," Eleanor said calmly, her voice carrying absolute authority despite the chaos around them. "This marriage represents hope for all our families. Anyone who opposes it opposes peace itself." Marshal Patterson moved quickly to disarm and arrest Jake, while members of both families stared in stunned silence at the bride who had just saved her new husband's life. The message was unmistakable. Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman to be underestimated, and she would protect her new family with the same fierce loyalty she had always shown her birth family. In the weeks that followed, the story of Eleanor's quick thinking and deadly accuracy spread throughout the territory, becoming the stuff of legend. More importantly, her actions that night seemed to convince even the most stubborn members of both families that the marriage was genuine and that the new alliance would be defended by force if necessary. 5 years later, as Samuel watched Eleanor teaching their twin sons to ride horses in the pasture that now bore both family names, he reflected on the wisdom of her decision to carry that derringer. She had not only saved his life that night, she had saved the future they were building together one day at a time. The end.